I built a fence on my own land. She called it a felony. The HOA slapped me with $5,000 in weekly fines. I almost lost the ranch my grandfather built with his hands. Then I disappeared from the neighborhood for 6 long months. When I came back, I brought a survey crew and a lawyer. What I found in the county archive changed everything. By the end of that summer, she was the one begging me. My name is Wade Coleman, and for 11 years I've lived on 62 acres at the edge of Cedar Hollow Lake. Land my grandfather Walt bought back in 1968 before there was ever a subdivision, a clubhouse, or a homeowners association telling anyone what color their mailbox had to be. I share the ranch with my wife Dana and our daughter Maisie, who's 7 and thinks the barn cats are her personal staff. We raise a few head of cattle, grow and mostly keep to ourselves until Silver Pine Lake Estates got built next door and brought its own weather system with it. The subdivision went up in phases starting around 2015. 40-some houses ringing the west shore of the lake. All vinyl siding and identical mailbox posts, governed by a homeowners association that took itself far more seriously than a group managing a gate code and a shared dumpster ever should. At the head of that association sat Cheryl and Pretty, a retired regional sales manager who moved in during Phase 2 and, within 18 months, had appointed herself president, treasurer, and self-declared moral compass of Silver Pine Lake Estates, a role nobody remembered actually voting her into. Cheryl drove a white Escalade with a magnetic HOA seal stuck crooked on the door, carried a laminated copy of the covenants in her purse, and had opinions about lawn height, holiday lights, and, eventually, my grandfather's 62 acres, which technically sat outside her subdivision's boundary line entirely. For years there'd been an old dirt and gravel cut through what everyone just called the ranch road, running along the edge of my property down to the county highway. My grandfather had let the original lake cabin owners use it as a shortcut back in the 70s, long before any HOA existed. It was never a deeded easement, just an old man's kindness, tolerated year after year, the kind of quiet southern arrangement built on a handshake and nothing on paper. My father kept the tradition going. He kept it going too, right up until Cheryl decided my kindness was actually her entitlement. The trouble really started the spring I decided to fence the lakeside boundary of my property. Maisie had started wandering toward the water on her own, and stray dogs from the subdivision kept getting into my hayfield, spooking the cattle. A simple 4-rail perimeter fence seemed like common sense. I pulled the county permit, hired a local contractor named Roy Tibbs, and we started setting posts along my own surveyed property line in early April, nowhere near the ranch road itself, just along the waterside where my land met the public shoreline easement everyone in the county was entitled to use. Cheryl showed up on day 2 in her Escalade, hazards blinking, before Roy had even poured the second post. She stood at the property line in white sneakers that had clearly never touched dirt and informed me, without introducing herself, that my fence violated the community's viewshed standards. I told her, politely, that my land wasn't part of Silver Pine Lake Estates, had never signed onto any HOA covenants, and that a viewshed standard couldn't apply to property she didn't govern. She smiled the tight smile of someone who'd already decided I was wrong before I spoke. "We'll see about that," she said, and got back in her Escalade. I figured that was the end of it, a mildly annoying neighbor letting off steam. Dana laughed it off that night over dinner. Neither of us had any idea what Cheryl Pretty considered a closed conversation. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from something called the Silver Pine Lake Estates Architectural Review Committee, informing me that my fence was
under review for unauthorized construction impacting shared community aesthetics and access corridors, and that further work should cease pending a hearing.
I called the county planning office to double-check my permit was solid. It was father, retired now in Tucson, who just laughed and said Cheryl sounded like the third one of these types the lake had seen since the 80s, and that they always burned out eventually. Still, something about the letter's language nagged at me, that phrase access corridors specifically. My land didn't share a boundary with any road the HOA legally controlled. I filed the letter in a drawer, told Roy to keep building, and went back to my regular life, thinking the matter was settled. I should have paid closer attention. Looking back, that letter wasn't really about the fence at all. It was Cheryl testing how much resistance I'd put up before she escalated, the same way she probably tested every homeowner who'd ever pushed back against her before finding their breaking point. The real trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Roy called me, voice tight, saying 2 Silver Pine residents and a man with a clipboard were standing in my hayfield measuring distances from my half-finished fence to the ranch road, which sat a good 90 yards from where we were building. By the time I got out there, Cheryl had assembled what looked like a small delegation, herself, 2 board members I recognized from mailbox flyers, and a surveyor she introduced as an independent expert, though his truck had a Silver Pine Lake Estates parking sticker on the windshield. "This fence," Cheryl announced, sweeping her arm toward my half-built rail line, "constitutes an obstruction of the community's legal easement for ingress and egress." I asked her, calmly, to point to the easement document. She said her attorney had it. I asked for a copy. Worked. That night I dug through my grandfather's old filing cabinet in the barn office. Boxes of deeds, tax records, and yellowed correspondence going back decades. I found nothing, no recorded easement, no grant, no agreement, just a single handwritten note from 1979. Let the cabin folks use the cut for now. Costs me nothing. For now. 45 years of for now. And somehow it had mutated in Cheryl's mind into a permanent, legally binding right. I made copies of everything, put the originals back, and started keeping a folder of my own dates, names, every letter, every conversation, time-stamped and printed. The HOA sent me an official notice the following week. A Level 2 violation, $500, for obstruction of a documented shared access corridor, with a threat that continued noncompliance would trigger daily accruing fines. I wasn't even a member of their association. I laughed out loud reading it. I called a lawyer, Marissa Alvarez, recommended by a rancher friend 2 counties over who'd fought his own HOA battle years back. Marissa listened to the whole story, went quiet for a second, then said, "Send me everything you have. This smells like someone who's used to people just paying to make it go away." Marissa's first move was simple. A formal letter stating I was not a Silver Pine Lake Estates member. My property wasn't subject to their covenants, and any claimed easement needed to be produced with an actual recorded instrument or the HOA would be exposed to a claim for harassment and slander of title. Cheryl's response came fast. Not from a lawyer, but from her personally. A 4-page email CC to the entire HOA board and, oddly, half the subdivision's residents, accusing me of threatening legal action against a grieving community trying to protect its children's safe walking route. Nobody had ever walked children down the ranch road. It was gravel, rutted, edged by barbed wire and cattle, used exclusively by trucks cutting 5 minutes off the drive to the highway. But by the next morning, 3 separate neighbors had left snide comments about me on the community Facebook group. Dana found the Facebook thread before I did, 40-some comments. People who'd never met me speculating about what kind of man fences off children from safety. I wasn't even in the group. Cheryl had screenshotted my lawyer's letter and posted it out of context, redacting the parts that undercut her story. I made an account just to respond. Posted the actual property survey, the tax parcel map showing my land outside HOA boundaries, and a photo of the fence's real distance from the road. The post got 17 likes and 1 comment from Cheryl. Convenient how you have all this ready. Wait, that comment stuck with me longer than it should have. It wasn't defensive. Like she already knew this was going to be a fight, and she'd fought it before, and she expected to win it the same way she always had, by simply outlasting whoever stood in her way. A week later, the HOA board, 5 people, 3 of whom I later learned rarely showed up to meetings, voted unanimously to authorize legal action to preserve the community's historic access rights. Marissa reviewed the meeting minutes Cheryl posted and pointed out something odd. The vote happened in 11 minutes flat. Real boards argue, Marissa said. This reads like someone wrote the minutes before the meeting happened. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss as sloppy record-keeping. I filed it away next to that "for now" letter and that strange little comment about how convenient my preparation was. The lawsuit landed on my doorstep on a rainy Thursday. Silver Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association v. Wade Coleman, seeking a permanent injunction against the fence and a declaration of a prescriptive easement over the ranch road, plus attorney's fees. Cheryl was listed as the association's authorized representative and sole point of contact. Marissa read it twice before she looked up. Prescriptive easement claims require continuous, open, uninterrupted use for a set statutory period, she said. If your family ever closed that road, even once, for even a day, it breaks the clock. Did your grandfather or your dad ever close it? I remembered then, the way you remember something that had been sitting quiet in the back of your mind for years. My father used to chain off the ranch road every autumn during hunting season. For safety, for exactly 1 week, every single year, going back as far as I could recall as a boy. Better still, my grandfather had done the same thing during calving season each spring. A padlocked gate, a handwritten sign, closed for calving, photographed more than once in old family albums because Grandpa Walt loved his ancient Polaroid camera and documented everything, including things he never dreamed would matter decades later. I spent 2 full nights in the barn attic going through shoeboxes of photographs, and found 6 of them, 6 different years, 6 padlocked gates across the ranch road, dated on the back in Grandpa Walt's careful handwriting. If Cheryl's claim depended on unbroken continuous use, we now had proof it never existed. Marissa was thrilled but cautious. This helps enormously, she said, but it doesn't end things yet. Cheryl clearly believes she has something, or thinks the board's money and your fear of a lawsuit will make you fold before it ever gets to a judge. People like this rarely fight fair once they're losing. She was right faster than either of us expected. Within days, no trespassing, Reported to law enforcement signs appeared zip-tied to my own fence posts, signed by the HOA, on my property, without permission. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line to report it, expecting a routine report. The deputy who arrived, a young man named Cole Pretty, spent 10 minutes looking at my fence, my permit, and my property survey, then told me there wasn't much he could do since it was a civil HOA matter, and suggested I try to work things out amicably with Mrs. Pretty. It wasn't until he was leaving that I noticed his name tag again, Pretty, and asked, half joking, if he was any relation to Cheryl. He hesitated a beat too long before saying second cousin and getting in his cruiser. I stood in my driveway feeling the ground shift slightly under me. I mentioned it to Marissa the next morning. She didn't seem surprised. Small towns, she said. It doesn't mean corruption automatically, but it means we document every single interaction with law enforcement from here forward. In writing, with names and times, in case this ever becomes relevant to a pattern. 2 nights later, someone cut 3 strands of my new fence wire near the lake edge, letting 11 of my cattle wander loose along the shoreline until 4 in the morning. When a passing deputy, not Cole Pretty, thankfully, spotted them and called me to come round them up, I filed a police report for property damage and livestock endangerment. Cheryl posted on the community Facebook group the same day, expressing deep concern for the cattle's welfare and suggesting my fencing wasn't built to professional standards. A claim contradicted by the permit and inspection Roy Tibbs had on file with the county. Roy himself started getting strange phone calls. Someone claiming to be a concerned Silver Pine resident, asking pointed questions about his licensing, his insurance, and whether he'd cut corners on my job. Roy, who'd been building fences in this county for 22 years, was more insulted than intimidated. But it rattled him. I don't scare easy, Wade, Roy told me over coffee. But somebody's spending real effort trying to make my business look bad over a rail fence. That's not normal HOA behavior. That's personal, and it's organized, and I'd start wondering what this woman's actually protecting out on that road. Roy's comment lodged itself in my mind. What was she actually protecting? An extra 5 minutes on a commute wasn't worth this level of obsession for most people. I started paying closer attention to who actually used the ranch road, and noticed it wasn't ordinary Silver Pine traffic at all. Mostly one truck, a dark gray pickup, unmarked, made regular trips down the ranch road at odd hours, early morning, late at night several times a week, always turning around near the old boat launch at the lake's northern tip rather than continuing through to the highway like a genuine commuter shortcut would. I mentioned it to Dana, who'd noticed the same truck idling near our property line more than once. Maybe it's nothing, she said. But you don't obsess over a road unless the road means something to you specifically, not just to a subdivision full of people you claim to be protecting. I didn't have proof of anything yet, just a hunch and a truck's silhouette in the dark. So I bought a cheap trail camera at the farm supply store and mounted it on a fence post facing the ranch road, angled to catch anything driving through during the odd hours we'd noticed. Meanwhile, the lawsuit ground forward through the discovery process. Marissa requested the HOA produce any recorded easement, any deed reference, any prior board resolution establishing the ranch road as community property. Cheryl's attorney, a young associate clearly overwhelmed, kept requesting extensions, which Marissa said was itself telling. If they had a document, she told me, they'd have led with it. Every extension is time spent trying to manufacture something that looks official enough to survive a judge's questions. I've seen this before. It rarely ends well for the side stalling, especially once a judge notices the pattern too. The HOA fines kept accruing regardless of the pending lawsuit. $500 a week compounding into a threatened lien against a property I'd already proven wasn't even under their jurisdiction. Marissa filed a motion to have the fines suspended pending the outcome. It would take 6 weeks to be heard. 6 weeks of watching a growing number in a letter I knew was baseless but couldn't simply ignore. Because ignoring HOA liens, even illegitimate ones, can cloud a property title for years if left unchallenged. I started keeping a spreadsheet, cataloging every fine, every letter, every incident, building the case Marissa needed. The trail camera caught its first useful footage 9 days in, the same gray pickup. For 40 in the morning, pulling off the ranch road onto an overgrown spur trail that led toward an old equipment shed on HOA-owned common land near the lake. A building I'd genuinely forgotten still existed. I mentioned the shed to Roy, who'd done maintenance work for the subdivision years earlier before Cheryl took over. That shed used to store the old maintenance equipment, he said. Mowers, a tractor, stuff like that. HOA stopped maintaining common areas themselves too. 3 years back. Contracted it out. Curiosity got the better of me. On a Saturday when the trail camera showed the gray truck was elsewhere, I walked the spur trail myself, careful to stay on the public shoreline easement rather than trespass onto HOA land, and got close enough to see the shed had a brand new commercial-grade padlock. A new padlock on a supposedly empty maintenance shed struck me as exactly the kind of small, strange detail that mattered. I photographed it from a legal distance, noted the date, and added it to my growing folder, though I still had no idea what, if anything, it actually connected to. The following week, Marissa called with something unrelated but equally strange. The independent surveyor from that first confrontation, the man with the clipboard, turned out to hold no active state surveying license at all. His certification had lapsed 2 years earlier for unpaid continuing education fees, invalidating any report he'd filed. His name is Dennis Foy, Marissa said. And his so-called survey, the one claiming your fence encroaches on the ranch road corridor, isn't worth the paper it's printed on. But someone paid him to produce it, knowing or not knowing it was invalid, and I'd bet real money it was Cheryl personally. That was the first real twist I couldn't unsee. This wasn't an overzealous neighbor misunderstanding property lines. Someone had gone out and hired a lapsed surveyor to manufacture a document supporting a claim that had no legal foundation, then presented it to the HOA board as expert evidence. That takes intent. I brought the trail camera footage, the shed padlock photos, and the surveyor's lapsed license to Marissa in one folder. She spread it all across her desk, quiet for a long moment, then said, "Wade, I don't think this was ever really about your fence. I think your fence just exposed something else." We agreed to keep both threads moving, the lawsuit itself, which was still my most immediate legal exposure, and the quiet documentation of everything strange happening around that shed and that gray truck, which felt like it might matter far more before this was over, though neither of us knew how yet. Cheryl, unaware how much ground she'd already lost, escalated anyway. A Level 3 violation notice arrived threatening to place a formal lien on my property despite Marissa's pending motion. And despite the fact I still wasn't legally a member of the HOA she claimed authority to fine me under. Marissa fired back a sharp letter warning that filing a lien against a non-member's property with no legal basis could itself constitute slander of title, a tort with real damages attached. For the first time, Cheryl's own attorney seemed to intervene, and the lien threat quietly disappeared from subsequent letters. But Cheryl herself didn't quiet down. She started showing up to community events with what she called the Coleman Fence Files, a poster board timeline of my supposed offenses, complete with photos of my cattle, my fence, and, unsettlingly, a long-lens photo of Maisie playing in our own front yard. Dana saw red when I showed her that photo, blown up on Cheryl's poster board at a silver pine block party. Our 7-year-old daughter turned into a prop in someone else's grievance campaign. That's it, Dana said. This isn't about offense to her anymore. This is personal. And now it's about our kid. Marissa agreed the photo crossed a line and sent a formal cease and desist regarding the use of Maisie's image, citing harassment and privacy concerns. Cheryl removed the poster board photo within a day, but the community group chats had already screenshotted and circulated it, and the damage to the narrative was done. I started noticing something else. Several Silver Pine residents, people who'd initially piled on against me in the Facebook comments, had gone quiet, or in a couple cases, quietly reached out to apologize. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Bonnie Askew, messaged me directly, "I don't think Cheryl's telling us everything." Bonnie and I met for coffee, cautious on both sides. She told me she'd been on the HOA Finance Committee 2 years earlier, before resigning after what she called irregularities in the reserve fund reports that Cheryl always brushed off as accounting software glitches whenever anyone asked pointed questions during meetings. "I never had proof," Bonnie admitted. "Just a feeling the numbers didn't add up between what we collected in dues and what actually sat in the account. I resigned instead of making a scene. Maybe that was cowardly. But if you're already fighting her in court, maybe I can finally say something useful." Bonnie agreed to give a sworn statement about the reserve fund discrepancies she'd noticed, though she cautioned it was circumstantial, nothing she could prove definitively on her own. Still, Marissa said it was another thread worth pulling. Another data point suggesting Cheryl's grip on Silver Pine Lake Estates ran deeper than fence disputes. By early June, we'd assembled a strange, sprawling case file, a baseless easement claim, a lapsed license surveyor, a padlocked shed on common land, a mystery truck with odd hours, and now whispers of missing HOA money. None of it alone would win my fence lawsuit. Together, painted a much bigger picture. Marissa's motion to suspend the accruing fines finally got its hearing date in late June. I felt something between relief and dread walking into that county courthouse. Relief that a judge would finally hear the actual facts. Dread that Cheryl had shown no sign of backing down no matter what evidence surfaced. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. Marissa laid out the property survey showing my land outside HOA boundaries, the tax parcel records, and Grandpa Walt's photographs of the padlocked gates breaking any claim of continuous prescriptive use. The judge suspended all fines immediately and set a full trial date for September. Cheryl sat 2 rows behind the HOA's attorney, arms crossed, jaw tight, saying nothing the entire hearing. Walking out, she caught my eye in the courthouse hallway and said only, This isn't over, Wade. In a voice quiet enough that only I heard it, which somehow felt worse than if she'd shouted. For a few weeks after that hearing, things genuinely calmed down. No new violation letters. No strange trucks on the trail camera at odd hours. No poster boards at community events. Dana and I let ourselves believe, cautiously, that the suspended fines and the coming trial date had finally cooled things off. We spent the 4th of July hosting a small barbecue for a few close friends. Maisie running around with sparklers. Cattle grazing peacefully in the background. The ranch rode quiet under a hot summer sun. Felt, for the first time in months, like our ordinary life had been handed back to us. I kept the trail camera running out of habit more than suspicion during that stretch. Mostly catching deer, the occasional raccoon, and Roy Tibbs's truck when he came by to check a gate hinge. The gray pickup didn't reappear on the footage at all for nearly 3 straight weeks that July. Bonnie Askew and I kept in touch during the lull, and she mentioned, almost offhand, that Cheryl had abruptly canceled the HOA's annual midsummer financial review meeting, citing scheduling conflicts, despite the review being a bylaw requirement every July for the past 6 years, without a single prior cancellation. That's not like her, Bonnie said. Cheryl loves those meetings. She runs them like a courtroom. Canceling one, especially now, feels less like a scheduling conflict and more like someone who doesn't want certain numbers looked at too closely while other people are already asking questions in the background. Marissa used the quiet stretch to formally request, through discovery, 3 years of HOA financial records as part of building our defense, arguing the association's decision-making process and use of member funds toward this lawsuit were directly relevant to whether the suit itself had been pursued in good faith. The HOA's attorney objected, calling the request a fishing expedition unrelated to the fence dispute. The judge, reviewing both sides' filings, disagreed in part, ordering a narrower but still meaningful set of records be produced, reserve fund statements and any expenditures specifically tied to legal action against me. Cheryl fought that order harder than she'd fought almost anything else in the case, filing her own emergency motion to quash it, arguing financial privacy for HOA members. It was the first time I'd seen her attorney visibly frustrated with his own client, based on Marissa's read of the filings. People don't fight that hard to protect a boring spreadsheet, Marissa told me over the phone. They fight that hard when the spreadsheet has their name written all over something they never wanted anyone to see. I think we're getting close to whatever she's actually been protecting this whole time. The judge ultimately denied Cheryl's motion to quash and ordered the records produced within 30 days. When Marissa relayed the news, I felt something shift, quiet and certain, the way weather shifts before a storm you can't yet see but can somehow already feel pressing against the air around you. That same week, Bonnie called me late one evening, voice hushed like she was worried about being overheard even in her own kitchen. Cheryl just resigned from the Finance Committee's oversight role, she said. Handed it to her friend Denise instead, 2 days before records were due. That's not a coincidence. Wait, I passed the information to Marissa, who added it to the growing timeline she was building for trial. Whatever Cheryl had been hiding behind that canceled meeting, that quashed motion, and now this sudden resignation, it was starting to feel less like paranoia and more like the outline of something real. The financial records arrived in early August. 3 bankers' boxes delivered to Marissa's office, and she spent an entire weekend combing through them with a forensic accountant friend who owed her a favor. What they found took the case somewhere neither of us had expected when this started over a simple fence. Over roughly 2.5 years, the HOA's reserve fund, money collected specifically for major infrastructure repairs like road resurfacing and the boat launch dock, had shrunk by nearly $90,000, with no corresponding capital projects on record to explain where that money had actually gone. Buried in the expense categories were repeated payments labeled landscaping consulting and community beautification services, paid quarterly to a business
called Pretty Property Solutions, LLC. A company registered, according to state records Marissa pulled, at Cheryl Pretty's own home address on Lakeview Court.
"She's been paying herself," Marissa said, staring at the printout, "through a shell company, using HOA reserve funds meant for road repairs and dock maintenance, for services that, as far as I can tell from these invoices, were never actually performed by anyone." The lapsed licensed surveyor suddenly made more sense too. Dennis Foy, turned out, wasn't just some random hired surveyor Cheryl found in a phone book. Marissa's forensic accountant traced 2 invoices from Pretty Property Solutions LLC that matched almost exactly, in dollar amount and date, payments Foy had received the same week he produced his fraudulent encroachment report. The pieces clicked into a shape that finally made sense. Cheryl hadn't sued me over a fence because of aesthetics or safety at all. She'd sued me because a legitimate, court-scrutinized challenge to the ranch road's ownership risked exposing exactly why she was so desperate to control access to that shed and land nearby. If the ranch road and the surrounding common area ever came under closer legal or surveyor scrutiny through my case, someone might eventually ask why an HOA president kept a padlocked shed on unmonitored common land, paid herself through a shell company, and fought so hard to avoid a routine July finance review. Marissa believed, though she was careful to call it a working theory rather than proven fact, that the shed likely held equipment or materials tied to some kind of unauthorized side operation Cheryl was running on association land, financed quietly by association money, hidden behind a fence dispute loud enough to distract everyone. We didn't have hard proof of what was actually inside that shed yet. Only the padlock, the odd hours of the gray truck, and the financial trail pointing toward Pretty Property Solutions LLC. Marissa cautioned patience. "We build this carefully," she said.
"One reckless move and
I reactivated the trail camera with fresh batteries and repositioned it slightly for a clearer angle on the spur trail leading to the shed, resisting every urge to march over there myself and rip that padlock off, because Marissa reminded me, repeatedly, that trespassing on HOA land would hand Cheryl exactly the ammunition she wanted. Within a week, the gray truck reappeared on camera, this time at nearly 11 at night, the driver visible for a brief moment under the truck's dome light while unloading something from the truck bed. It wasn't a stranger. It was Dennis Foy, the same lapsed license surveyor, hauling boxes into the shed. Marissa forwarded the footage to her forensic accountant contact, who flagged something interesting. Several of the Pretty Property Solutions LLC invoices referenced equipment storage fees, an odd line item for a landscaping consulting business with no known clients, employees, or public presence beyond the invoices themselves paid out of HOA funds. We were building, slowly and carefully, toward September's trial date with something far larger than a fence dispute now sitting quietly in Marissa's case file. Misappropriated HOA funds, a fraudulent survey, a fake landscaping company, and mysterious late-night shed deliveries. all orbiting around one increasingly desperate homeowners association president. Cheryl, seemingly sensing the walls closing in even without knowing exactly what we'd found, shifted tactics entirely in mid-August, suddenly dropping the encroachment framing altogether and instead filing a new, separate complaint accusing me of harassment and intimidation for supposedly following HOA vehicles and photographing HOA property. Marissa recognized it immediately as a preemptive strike, an attempt to muddy the record before trial, painting me as the aggressor in case any of our discoveries about the shed or the finances ever surfaced publicly. She's trying to get ahead of a story she doesn't even know we've fully pieced together yet, Marissa said. The harassment complaint required us to disclose, at least partially, why the trail camera existed in the first place, which meant introducing the shed footage and the odd hours pattern into the official case record earlier than we'd planned. A tactical setback that Marissa handled by narrowing exactly what we revealed. We disclosed only footage relevant to defending against the harassment claim itself, showing the camera was mounted entirely on my own property, facing my own boundary line, capturing public activity on a public adjacent road. Nothing that constituted illegal surveillance of Cheryl or her home specifically, which the judge accepted without much argument. But the disclosure had one unintended consequence that worked entirely in our favor. It put the gray truck, the late-night shed visits, and Dennis Foy's presence on the official record before trial, meaning the judge, the court reporter, and opposing counsel now all had documented knowledge of it existing. Cheryl's attorney, reviewing the newly disclosed footage, apparently asked her directly what it showed and why her lapsed license surveyor was making late-night deliveries to an HOA maintenance shed. According to Bonnie, who heard it secondhand from another board member, Cheryl's answer was vague, defensive, and satisfied absolutely no one in that room. Within days, the HOA's attorney filed a motion to withdraw from representing the association entirely, citing professional conflicts, language Marissa recognized. Instantly as lawyer code for a client who'd stopped being honest with their own counsel. A serious warning sign this close to a scheduled trial date in September. The court granted a short continuance to allow the HOA time to secure new counsel, pushing our trial back 3 weeks into October. Frustrating as the delay was, Marissa saw an upside. More time meant more opportunity for the forensic accounting picture, and whatever sat inside that shed, to come further into focus. Bonnie's information network inside Silver Pine Lake Estates kept producing small, useful details during that extra time. 2 other board members, she said, had started quietly asking Cheryl direct questions about the canceled July review and the withdrawn attorney. Questions Cheryl reportedly deflected by blaming outside legal interference from my case. One evening in late August, Cole Pretty, the deputy, Cheryl's second cousin, showed up unannounced at my property, out of uniform, driving his personal truck rather than a cruiser. He said he wanted to talk off the record and asked if he could come sit on the porch for a few minutes. I let him, cautiously, Dana standing nearby with her arms crossed. Cole admitted, haltingly, that his earlier dismissiveness about the fence-cutting incident hadn't sat right with him since, and that he'd recently overheard his aunt, Cheryl's sister, not Cheryl herself, mention Cheryl's storage problem, needing to disappear before any lawsuit went further. He didn't know details. He insisted, and he wasn't there to testify to anything officially. Just felt like I deserved to know something strange was clearly going on. and that he regretted not looking harder into the fence-cutting report months earlier when it might have actually meant something to this case. I thanked him, genuinely, and told Marissa about the visit the next morning. She couldn't use an off-the-record porch conversation as evidence, but it confirmed something we'd both begun to suspect independently. Whatever sat inside that shed, multiple people close to Cheryl already knew it existed and knew it was a liability. Marissa filed a motion requesting a court-ordered inspection of the HOA common area shed, arguing its contents were directly relevant to the harassment counterclaim, and to establishing the true motive behind the original lawsuit against me, since the shed sat suspiciously close to the disputed Ranch Road corridor itself. The new HOA attorney, a sharper, more cautious lawyer named Preston Vance, who'd clearly been brought in to do damage control, fought the inspection motion hard, arguing it was overbroad and unrelated to a fence encroachment case. The judge took the motion under advisement, promising a ruling before the October trial. While we waited on that ruling, Cheryl made what turned out to be her most damaging move yet, though we wouldn't fully understand its significance for another few weeks. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and pushed through a vote to sell the maintenance shed and its surrounding half-acre to a private buyer. Bonnie attended that meeting and said Cheryl rushed the vote through in under 10 minutes, refusing to answer questions about the buyer's identity or the sale price, insisting only that it was, in the community's best financial interest, to liquidate an unused asset before winter maintenance costs became a burden on dues. The timing, coming just days after our shed inspection motion was filed, struck Marissa as almost comically transparent. She immediately filed an emergency motion to block the sale, arguing it appeared designed specifically to move or destroy evidence relevant to pending litigation, a claim called spoliation that judges take extremely seriously. The judge agreed, issuing a temporary restraining order halting the shed's sale and ordering its contents preserved exactly as they stood, pending the court's ruling on our inspection motion. When the order was served, according to Bonnie, Cheryl reportedly turned white as a sheet, reading it in her own kitchen. 3 days later, the judge ruled in our favor on the inspection motion, ordering a supervised walkthrough of the shed with both parties' attorneys present, a court-appointed appraiser, and a sheriff's deputy, specifically not Cole Pretty, to oversee the process and document everything found inside for the official record. I wasn't allowed to attend personally, only Marissa, but she called me the moment it ended, her voice carrying an edge of controlled excitement I hadn't heard from her before. "Wade," she said, "you are not going to believe what's sitting in that shed. This changes absolutely everything about this case." Inside, investigators found stacks of unopened HOA mailers with a different address printed on them. A rental property Cheryl owned 2 towns over, suggesting mail redirection possibly tied to insurance or tax fraud unrelated to the fence case entirely. But that wasn't even the most damaging discovery in that building. They also found 4 sealed filing boxes containing what appeared to be an entirely separate set of HOA financial ledgers, a shadow accounting system tracking cash.
Payments collected from residents for special assessments that never appeared in the official HOA books Marissa's forensic accountant had already reviewed months earlier.
Cross-referencing names on those shadow ledgers against actual Silver Pine Lake Estates residents, Marissa's accountant found at least 14 homeowners had paid Cheryl, in cash, sums ranging from $300 to over $2,000, for supposed expedited violation resolution fees that appeared nowhere in official HOA records at all. In other words, Cheryl hadn't just been quietly padding a shell company invoice here and there. She'd built an entire secondary system for extracting cash directly from frightened, intimidated homeowners who wanted their violation notices to simply go away. And she'd been doing it, based on the ledger dates, for nearly 4 years. Bonnie, when Marissa carefully showed her a redacted portion of the ledger with her consent, immediately recognized her own name and a payment she'd genuinely forgotten, making 3 years earlier $600 cash to make a disputed fence height violation on her own property disappear before it escalated to a lien. "I thought I was just being pragmatic," Bonnie admitted, embarrassed. She made it sound so normal, like everyone did it, like it was just how things got handled quietly around here without dragging the whole board into some big dramatic fight. "I never once thought it might be illegal." "Not really." Marissa explained it plainly to both of us. Extorting cash payments under threat of association penalties, outside any documented, board-approved fee structure, likely constituted extortion and fraud under state law, on top of the reserve fund embezzlement already suggested by the Pretty Property Solutions LLC invoices from the official books. We now had 2 entirely separate financial crimes potentially sitting on top of a baseless lawsuit built from a fraudulent survey, and every single
thread traced back to the same person who'd started this whole ordeal by objecting to a rail fence built 90 yards from a road she never actually owned.
Marissa immediately reported the shadow ledger discovery to the district attorney's office, separate from our civil fence case, since evidence of extortion and financial fraud against multiple homeowners fell squarely into criminal territory well beyond anything a private civil lawsuit between me and an HOA could address on its own. Word moved through Silver Pine Lake Estates faster than any of us expected, despite the case technically still being under seal for the criminal referral. Bonnie said residents were comparing notes in group chats, several recognizing their own expedited resolution payments listed with dates matching the shadow ledger discovery from the shed. Cheryl, for her part, went uncharacteristically silent for nearly a week. No Facebook posts, no violation letters, no poster boards. A silence far more unsettling to those watching her than any of her previous escalations had been. According to Bonnie's texts, which grew increasingly frequent as the week wore on. When Cheryl finally reappeared publicly, it wasn't with an apology or an explanation. She posted a long statement to the community Facebook group claiming she was the target of a coordinated smear campaign led by a disgruntled non-resident landowner and his lawyer, meaning me, apparently, and never once addressed the ledgers directly. The post backfired badly. Where months earlier the community had rallied instinctively behind their HOA president against an outside landowner, this time the comments turned sharply skeptical. Several residents openly asking why she wouldn't simply address the specific documents that had reportedly been found, rather than attacking the messenger instead. Preston Vance, the HOA's attorney, apparently advised Cheryl in the strongest possible terms to stop posting publicly about pending litigation, a piece of advice she evidently ignored, based on 2 more increasingly erratic Facebook posts appearing over the following days before the account abruptly went private and then disappeared entirely. Marissa used the window of public exposure to formally request the fence lawsuit and the harassment counterclaim be consolidated with a new civil fraud claim on my behalf,
seeking damages for the fines I'd been forced to fight, the legal fees incurred, and the reputational harm from Cheryl's public accusations against me and Maisie.
The judge granted consolidation, setting one combined trial date in late October to resolve everything at once. the original fence encroachment claim, my defamation and harassment countersuit, and the fraud allegations tied directly to the shed discovery, now formally woven into a single sprawling case far bigger than anyone anticipated in April. Preston Vance quietly reached out to Marissa proposing a settlement on the HOA's behalf regarding the original fence claim specifically, effectively conceding it had no merit, hoping to separate that piece from the larger, far more damaging fraud allegations still swirling around Cheryl personally rather than the association as a whole. Marissa and I discussed it carefully. Settling the fence claim alone wouldn't stop the criminal referral already sitting with the district attorney, and it wouldn't address the defamation and harassment Cheryl had personally directed at me and my family. We declined the partial settlement, wanting everything resolved together, publicly, in open court. She doesn't get to make the fence disappear quietly, I told Marissa, and leave everything else buried. If people in that neighborhood paid her cash to make their problems vanish, they deserve to see this handled in the open, not tucked away behind a private settlement that protects her reputation one more time. As October approached, Cheryl's behavior grew visibly more erratic. According to multiple neighbors who reported strange incidents to Bonnie, who in turn kept me and Marissa updated, she was seen arguing loudly with Denise, her replacement on the finance committee, in the Silver Pine Clubhouse parking lot over what witnesses called missing paperwork. One night in mid-September, my trail camera caught something far more alarming than a late-night shed delivery. A figure, hooded, moving along my fence line around 2 in the morning, stopping directly at the section nearest the ranch road, working at something with what looked like bolt cutters before a dog barked and scared them off. I called the sheriff's office immediately, and this time a different deputy responded seriously, documenting cut fence wire in 2 additional sections and taking the trail camera footage as evidence. The figure's face was never clearly visible, but Marissa noted the timing matched almost exactly with Cheryl's parking lot argument the same week. 2 days later, 8 of my cattle got loose again through the newly cut sections, wandering onto the county highway before a passing trucker managed to slow traffic and help me herd them back. One heifer suffered a leg injury requiring an emergency vet visit costing nearly $2,000 I hadn't budgeted for. Marissa amended our civil complaint to include the vandalism and resulting veterinary costs as additional damages, arguing a clear pattern of escalating harassment tied directly to the ongoing litigation. The sheriff's office, meanwhile, opened its own separate investigation into the fence cutting, treating it now as a criminal matter rather than routine vandalism. Cheryl's public silence broke again, this time not on Facebook but in a rambling voicemail left on Bonnie's phone late one night, accusing Bonnie of betraying the neighborhood and feeding lies to an outsider's lawyer. A voicemail Bonnie saved and, after some hesitation, agreed to turn over to Marissa as potential evidence. The voicemail's tone alarmed even people who'd known Cheryl for years. Bonnie described it as unhinged, Cheryl's voice cracking between fury and something closer to panic, at one point saying, "I built this neighborhood. I protected all of you, and this is how it ends. With everyone turning on me over nothing." Over nothing struck Marissa as a telling phrase to use about extortion, embezzlement, and fraudulent survey documents. She flagged the voicemail as evidence of Cheryl's state of mind and continued pattern of harassment against witnesses in the case, strengthening our defamation and harassment claims well beyond the original fence dispute itself. Around this time, Dennis Foy, the lapsed license surveyor, apparently reached out to Preston Vance directly, seeking to distance himself from Cheryl entirely and offering, through his own newly hired attorney, to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency regarding his role in producing the fraudulent encroachment survey used in the original lawsuit. Foy's statement, once shared with Marissa through the discovery process, confirmed what we'd already suspected from the invoices. Cheryl had paid him directly, in cash from Pretty Property Solutions LLC, to produce a survey report showing my fence encroaching on the ranch road, despite his own measurements at the time showing otherwise. She told me the neighborhood needed the road protected. Foy's statement read, according to Marissa, and that a few numbers adjusted here and there wouldn't hurt anybody,
since it would probably just make the landowner move his fence back a bit.
Foy's cooperation gave the district attorney's office exactly what they needed to formally add fraud charges related to the fabricated survey to the growing list of allegations.
Already under investigation from the Shadow Ledger discovery, transforming what began as a civil fence dispute into a genuine, multi-count criminal case against Cheryl personally.
News of criminal charges being formally filed spread through Silver Pine Lake Estates within hours. This time confirmed rather than rumored, as court records became publicly searchable. Bonnie texted me a screenshot of the docket the moment it appeared online. Cheryl and Pretty, charged with fraud, extortion, and forgery, released on bond. I sat with that screenshot for a long time that evening, feeling something more complicated than triumph. This had started as a fight to protect a fence I'd built to keep my daughter safe near the water. It had somehow unraveled into exposing years of quiet harm done to an entire neighborhood I barely knew. Dana found me still staring at my phone on the porch after Maisie had gone to bed. "You didn't do this to her," she said, reading my face correctly. "She did this to herself. One lie at a time. Over years. Long before we ever built that fence. You just happened to be the one she picked wrong with." Cheryl, out on bond, made one final desperate move before the criminal case fully absorbed public attention. She filed for an emergency restraining order against me personally, claiming fear for her safety based on the trail camera footage and my pattern of surveillance, an accusation Marissa dismantled easily using the camera's documented placement. The judge denied the restraining order outright, noting in his written ruling that a camera mounted on one's own property, facing one's own boundary line, capturing footage that ultimately assisted a criminal fraud investigation, could hardly be characterized as harassment of the very person whose alleged misconduct it happened to help expose. Preston Vance withdrew from representing Cheryl personally shortly after that ruling, though he remained counsel for the HOA itself in the civil matter, now scrambling to distance the association's remaining reputation from its former president's actions, quickly proposing a full settlement of my original civil claims to limit further exposure. Marissa negotiated hard on my behalf. A formal admission the fence never encroached on any legitimate easement. Full reimbursement of all fines paid. Coverage of my veterinary and fence repair costs. Coverage of a significant portion of my legal fees, and a public retraction of every claim made against me and Maisie. The HOA board, now operating without Cheryl and desperate to move forward, accepted the settlement terms within a week rather than risk the remaining civil claims, proceeding to a trial that would only further expose the association's own negligence in ever allowing Cheryl this much unchecked control for so many years. But Cheryl herself remained a defendant personally in my defamation and harassment claims, separate from the HOA's settlement, and she refused every settlement offer Marissa proposed, apparently convinced, even facing criminal fraud charges, that she could still somehow win a civil case built on Facebook posts and a poster board photo of my daughter. She genuinely can't stop fighting, Marissa observed after another rejected offer. Some people, once they've built their entire identity around being right, around being the person in charge, simply cannot process losing gracefully. It's not strategy at this point. It's just an inability to accept what's already, objectively, over. As the October trial date approached, more Silver Pine residents came forward, some through Bonnie, some directly to the district attorney's investigators, describing their own cash payments, their own intimidating encounters with Cheryl, their own quiet decisions to simply pay rather than fight an HOA president who seemed to answer to no one. One elderly resident, a widower named Frank Delgado, described being told his deceased wife's memorial garden violated landscaping covenants and would need to be removed unless he paid an expedited waiver fee of $800, a payment that, sure enough, appeared in the shadow ledgers recovered from the shed. Frank's story, when Bonnie shared it with the wider community group chat with his permission, seemed to finally shatter whatever remaining sympathy some longtime residents had held for Cheryl. Even her closest allies on the old board began publicly distancing themselves, several issuing their own statements expressing regret for not questioning her sooner. Denise, the finance committee replacement Cheryl had installed herself, resigned entirely from the HOA board, telling Bonnie privately that she'd discovered, after finally getting real access to the books, discrepancies going back even further than the shadow ledger period the forensic accountant had already identified, possibly into Cheryl's very first year as president. Marissa's forensic accountant, brought back for a follow-up review using the newly available records Denise helped provide, revised the total estimated misappropriated funds upward significantly, now suggesting Cheryl had extracted well over $150,000 from Silver Pine Lake Estates residents and reserves across nearly 6 years as president. The scale of it stunned even Marissa, who'd handled financial fraud cases before. This wasn't impulsive, she told me. This was a sustained, deliberate operation run by someone smart enough to keep it just quiet enough, just plausible enough, for years, in a community that trusted her specifically because she seemed so competent and controlling. Cheryl's desperation showed in increasingly reckless behavior as October approached. A second late-night fence-cutting attempt, this time caught clearly on the newly repositioned trail camera showing her own face, unmistakable, working at the wire before fleeing when Roy Tibbs, staying over to help with harvest prep, shouted from the barn. The footage went straight to both the sheriff's office and the district attorney, adding a direct criminal trespassing and property destruction charge tied specifically and undeniably to Cheryl herself, no longer requiring inference from timing or circumstance, just her own face, clearly lit by the trail camera's infrared sensor, caught in the act. Bonnie reported that Cheryl's bond conditions were modified following that incident, adding restrictions preventing her from coming within a certain distance of my property, effectively barring her from the ranch road entirely, the very road her entire fraudulent lawsuit had claimed was a vital, irreplaceable community access route worth fighting me over. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The woman who'd sued me over blocking access to a road was now legally forbidden from using that same road herself,
Court ordered to stay away from the exact strip of gravel she'd once claimed my family's simple rail fence threatened to unjustly take from her community.
As word of the modified bond conditions spread, someone in the Silver Pine Facebook group, now managed by a new, more measured moderator after Cheryl's account, vanished, posted the old poster board photo of Maisie again, this time with a caption apologizing on behalf of the community for ever entertaining that display. Dana cried a little reading that apology post. Not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to relief. The strange feeling of watching a community slowly, imperfectly, correct its own course after months of believing the loudest, most confident voice in the room simply because she'd never given anyone a real reason to doubt her. Cheryl's criminal defense attorney, facing mounting evidence across fraud, extortion, forgery, and now trespassing and property destruction charges, began quietly exploring plea negotiations with the district attorney's office in early October. According to court filings Marissa monitored closely as our own civil trial date drew nearer with each passing week. Meanwhile, Frank Delgado, Bonnie, and 4 other residents formed an informal group, working with a separate attorney, to pursue their own civil restitution claims against Cheryl for the cash, expedited resolution fees documented in the shadow ledgers, a parallel case that would only add to her mounting legal and financial exposure. I found myself, oddly, feeling a flicker of something like sympathy watching it all unfold, quickly followed by the memory of Maisie's photo on that poster board, the cut fence wires, the injured heifer, the months of fear that a woman's obsession with control might genuinely cost my family the ranch my grandfather built. Don't feel sorry for her, Dana said gently when I mentioned it. Feel sorry for Frank, losing his wife's memorial garden money to a lie. Feel sorry for Bonnie, carrying guilt for years over a payment she made just to avoid trouble. Cheryl built every bit of this herself, one choice at a time. Marissa echoed something similar during our final trial preparation meeting in mid-October, reminding me that sympathy for someone's downfall didn't erase the deliberate harm they'd caused along the way, and that walking into court seeking accountability wasn't cruelty. It was simply making sure the actual costs of Cheryl's choices finally landed where they belonged. With Cheryl's criminal case now moving toward likely plea negotiations, and the HOA's civil settlement already finalized, our combined civil trial narrowed specifically to my remaining claims against Cheryl personally: defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and damages tied to the vandalism now directly, visually tied to her own actions. Cheryl's civil attorney, a replacement hired after Preston Vance's withdrawal, made one final settlement offer 3 days before trial, a fraction of what Marissa believed a jury would likely award given the trail camera footage, the poster board photo, the voicemail, and the mounting pile of corroborating witness statements from across the neighborhood. Marissa recommended I reject it, confident enough in our evidence that a public trial, with its verdict and its record, would serve a purpose beyond just financial compensation, would create an undeniable, permanent accounting of exactly what had happened, available to anyone in Silver Pine Lake Estates who still doubted the full truth. I trusted her judgment, and more than that, I found I genuinely wanted the trial now, wanted a jury of ordinary people to hear the whole strange, sprawling story from a fence, to a shed, to a shadow ledger, and reach their own verdict rather than let Cheryl quietly buy her way out one final time. We rejected the final offer. Marissa filed the last pretrial motions. The judge confirmed the October court date would proceed as scheduled. And for the first time since that certified letter arrived back in April, I felt something settle in my chest that I could only describe, honestly, as readiness rather than dread. The week before trial, Marissa and I spent hours preparing my testimony, walking through the timeline again and again, the permit, the survey, Grandpa Walt's padlocked gate photographs, the trail camera footage, the shed, the shadow ledgers, making sure every fact could stand cleanly on its own without relying on anyone else's memory or goodwill. Roy Tibbs agreed to testify about the fence's construction and his own strange, intimidating phone calls questioning his licensing. Bonnie agreed to testify about the canceled financial review, her own cash payment, and Cheryl's threatening voicemail. Frank Delgado agreed to testify about his wife's memorial garden and the expedited waiver fee. Dennis Foy, cooperating with prosecutors on the criminal side, was subpoenaed to testify in our civil trial as well, confirming under oath that Cheryl had personally directed and paid him to falsify the encroachment survey that started the entire lawsuit against me, closing the loop on exactly how this manufactured dispute began. Even Cole Pretty, the deputy, agreed to a limited testimony about the fence-cutting report he'd initially dismissed and the porch conversation he'd later initiated. Careful to stay within professional bounds but honest enough to acknowledge he wished he'd taken the very first report more seriously back when it might have mattered most. Dana decided, after long consideration, that she wanted to testify too, about the poster board photo of Maisie, about the fear of watching strange trucks idle near their property line, about raising a 7-year-old daughter in the shadow of a stranger's escalating obsession neither of them had ever asked to be part of. The night before trial, couldn't sleep, walked out to the barn around midnight and stood looking at Grandpa Walt's old filing cabinet. At the fence line beyond it running clean and unbroken now under the moonlight. At the ranch road quiet and empty, exactly as it had been for most of the last 50 years. I thought about my grandfather's simple handwritten note from 1979. Let the cabin folks use the cut for now. Costs me nothing. So generous, had somehow been twisted over decades into a lawsuit, a shed full of secrets, and a woman's entire fraudulent empire finally collapsing. Dana found me out there and didn't say much, just stood beside me for a while, the two of us quiet in the dark. Whatever happens tomorrow, she finally said, you already won the part that actually matters. Maisie still gets to grow up here, safe, on land your family actually built with honesty. Trial began on a crisp Monday morning in mid-October. The county courthouse's small civil courtroom fuller than Marissa said she'd ever seen it for a case this size. Word having clearly spread through both Silver Pine Lake estates and the broader county about the strange saga behind Wade Coleman versus Cheryl Pretty. Cheryl arrived with her new attorney, noticeably thinner than she'd been in April, wearing a conservative navy suit instead of her usual bright HOA-branded polos. No laminated covenants in sight. No poster boards. Nothing but a legal pad and an expression I couldn't quite read as she took her seat across the aisle. Marissa's opening statement was measured, methodical, promising the jury a story that began with a simple, legal fence and ended somewhere neither party could have predicted, urging them to follow the evidence carefully rather than any particular narrative. and to focus on documented facts rather than anyone's reputation or self-presentation. Cheryl's attorney's opening statement leaned heavily into painting her as a well-intentioned community leader who'd made some regrettable judgment errors while trying to protect her neighborhood,
carefully avoiding any direct reference to the criminal fraud charges still pending separately, a strategy Marissa had anticipated and prepared thoroughly to counter.
My testimony took most of the first day, walking the jury through the entire timeline chronologically. The permit, the fence, the first confrontation, the escalating letters, the lawsuit, the cut wires, the loose cattle, the poster board photo of Maisie, staying as factual and unemotional as I could manage under Marissa's careful questioning. Cross-examination from Cheryl's attorney focused heavily on whether I'd ever personally observed her cutting the fence wire myself before the second, clearer incident, trying to suggest earlier vandalism could have come from anyone. I answered honestly that I hadn't seen the first incident directly, only the aftermath and the loose cattle. Roy testified next, describing the strange phone calls questioning his licensing. Calm and matter-of-fact under cross-examination, refusing to be rattled when Cheryl's attorney suggested he might be biased given his ongoing business relationship with me, simply noting he'd been a licensed contractor in this county for over 2 decades regardless. Bonnie's testimony landed harder than anyone expected, her voice cracking slightly, describing the $600 cash payment she'd made 3 years earlier, the shame of admitting it publicly, and the threatening voicemail Cheryl left accusing her of betrayal simply for eventually telling the truth to investigators about the shadow ledgers. Frank Delgado's testimony about his late wife's memorial garden brought visible emotion to several jurors, describing in a quiet, steady voice how an $800 waiver fee had felt like the only way to protect the last physical thing he had left connecting him to 34 years of marriage before her passing. Dennis Foy's testimony, delivered under a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, confirmed clearly and directly that Cheryl had personally paid him, in cash, to falsify the survey report claiming my fence encroached on the ranch road, admitting under oath that his actual measurements at the time had shown no encroachment whatsoever. Cheryl's attorney tried hard to undermine Foy's credibility, pointing out his cooperation agreement gave him incentive to implicate Cheryl regardless of truth. Foy, to his credit, remained steady, simply repeating that the invoices, the timing, and his own original correct measurements spoke for themselves regardless of what motive anyone assigned him. Cole Pretty's testimony was brief but pointed, confirming his family relationship to Cheryl, his initial dismissal of the fence-cutting report, and his later decision to reach out privately after hearing concerning things from other family members about Cheryl's storage problem, needing to disappear before the lawsuit progressed any further. Dana's testimony closed our second day, her voice steady but her eyes shining as she described the poster board photo of Maisie, the strange trucks, the fear that had settled over their household for months, and the relief, finally, of watching a jury hear the whole documented truth in one place. Cheryl's own testimony, when she took the stand on the third day, was the moment the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. Her attorney walked her carefully through a narrative of a dedicated community leader overwhelmed by outside pressure, trying to protect Silver Pine Lake Estates from what she called unreasonable outside interests. Marissa's cross-examination was patient, methodical, devastating in its simplicity. She walked Cheryl through the invoices from Pretty Property Solutions LLC, the shadow ledgers, the shed padlock, the surveyor's payments. Asking simple factual questions Cheryl increasingly struggled to answer without contradicting either her own prior statements or the documented evidence itself. Did you pay Dennis Foy to falsify a survey report? Marissa asked directly. Cheryl hesitated, glanced at her attorney, then said, I paid him for consulting services. Marissa produced the invoice, dated the same week as the fraudulent report, matching almost exactly the amount listed as consulting fee, encroachment assessment. The jury's reaction was subtle but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. A shift in posture, a few exchanged glances, the particular stillness of people who'd just watched someone's carefully constructed story crack open in real time under the simple, relentless pressure of documents that simply refused to say anything else. By the end of her cross-examination, Cheryl had admitted, under the weight of the paper trail, that she'd paid Foy for the survey specifically, that pretty property. Solutions LLC had no other clients or actual business activity, and that the shed had, in fact, held both the shadow ledgers and personal storage unrelated to HOA business. What she still refused to admit, even then, was any wrongdoing in spirit, insisting repeatedly that everything she'd done was for the good of the community. A phrase she returned to so often that Marissa, in closing arguments the next morning, used it almost like a refrain against her. Cheryl pretty told you, from that stand, that everything she did was for the good of the community, Marissa told the jury in closing. Ask yourselves, which community benefited from a falsified survey, a fraudulent lawsuit, a hidden shed, cash extortion from a grieving widower, and a threatening voicemail to a longtime neighbor. Cheryl's attorney's closing leaned on sympathy and mitigation, asking the jury to consider the totality of years of genuine service before things went wrong, urging measured damages rather than the substantial amount Marissa had requested, framing this as a cautionary tale of good intentions eroded rather than deliberate, sustained fraud. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours, a duration Marissa said felt encouragingly short for a case this complex, suggesting the evidence had spoken clearly. Enough that extensive debate simply hadn't been necessary once they'd actually sat down together to weigh everything they'd heard across 3 full days of testimony. I spent those 4 hours pacing the courthouse hallway with Dana, both of us too anxious to sit still, occasionally catching Bonnie's eye across the waiting area, or Frank Delgado quietly reading a newspaper he clearly wasn't actually absorbing. Everyone bound together now by the strange shared ordeal of the last several months. Roy showed up during the wait too, still in his work clothes, having driven straight from a job site the moment Marissa texted that the jury had gone into deliberation. Wanted to be here for this part, he said simply, settling into a hallway chair like he had nowhere else in the world to be. When the bailiff finally called us back into the courtroom, my heart was pounding hard enough I could feel it in my ears. Dana's hand tight around mine, Marissa beside us with the calm, focused stillness of someone who'd done everything within her power and now simply had to wait like the rest of us. The jury foreperson stood, and the courtroom fell into that particular silence unique to a moment right before a verdict. The kind where even the old buildings' radiators seemed to hold their breath, everyone waiting to hear whether months of fighting, documenting, and finally testifying had actually amounted to something real. On the claim of defamation, the foreperson read, "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Wade Coleman, A quiet exhale rippled through our side of the courtroom. On the claim of harassment, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Dana's grip on my hand tightened until it nearly hurt, in the best possible way. On the claim of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the claim of property damage tied to the documented vandalism, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Each line landed like a small, steady drumbeat, months of fear and documentation finally translating into simple, official words. The jury awarded compensatory damages covering our legal fees, the veterinary costs, the fence repairs, and additional damages for emotional distress and reputational harm, totaling just over $210,000, along with a separate finding recommending punitive damages given the deliberate, sustained nature of Cheryl's conduct throughout the ordeal. The judge, reviewing the jury's punitive damages recommendation the following week, added an additional $90,000, citing in his written ruling the particularly egregious pattern of fabricated evidence, targeted harassment involving a minor child, and deliberate financial harm inflicted with apparent full awareness of its dishonesty throughout the case. Cheryl sat motionless as the verdict was read, her attorney's hand briefly on her shoulder, her expression unreadable in a way that felt almost hollow compared to the defiant certainty she'd carried through nearly every prior confrontation, as though something in her had simply run out of arguments left to make. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters from the regional paper, who'd been quietly covering the case since the criminal fraud charges first became public, asked me for a statement. I kept it brief. This was never about offense. It was about a lot of good people who deserved better than what they got. Bonnie hugged me on the courthouse steps, tears finally spilling over after holding herself together through months of anxious waiting. Frank Delgado shook my hand firmly, said simply, "Thank you for not letting her win," and walked off toward his car with something that looked, for the first time in a long while, like peace. Roy clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. "Told you that was the sturdiest fence I ever built," he said. And somehow, despite everything, we both actually laughed, standing there on the courthouse steps in the October sun, the whole absurd, exhausting saga finally settling into something we could look back on together. Marissa, packing up her files, told me the civil judgment would likely proceed to collections against Cheryl's remaining assets, including a possible forced sale of her Lakeview Court home, since the criminal restitution owed to Frank, Bonnie, and the other affected residents would also be competing for whatever assets she had left. 2 weeks later, Cheryl's criminal case concluded with a negotiated plea, guilty to charges of fraud, extortion, and forgery, with the trespassing and property destruction charges from the second fence-cutting incident added separately, resulting in a sentence combining probation, mandatory restitution, and, notably, 18 months of actual incarceration for the extortion counts specifically. The sentencing judge, reading her decision aloud, specifically noted Cheryl's position of trust within Silver Pine Lake Estates as an aggravating factor, stating that homeowners association leadership carried real responsibility over neighbors' money and peace of mind, a responsibility Cheryl had deliberately and repeatedly betrayed for personal financial gain over many years. Restitution was ordered covering every documented cash payment from the shadow ledgers, the misappropriated reserve funds traced to Pretty Property Solutions LLC, and a portion allocated toward my own civil judgment. Though Marissa cautioned collecting the full amount would likely take years given how thoroughly Cheryl had apparently spent what she'd taken. Bonnie later told me the HOA board, now entirely rebuilt with new members including, somewhat fittingly, Bonnie herself as the new treasurer, voted unanimously to formally negotiate a proper, legally recorded easement agreement for the ranch road with me directly, offering fair compensation and clear, documented terms neither side would ever have to guess about again. I agreed, on the condition the easement explicitly preserved my family's traditional seasonal closures during calving and hunting season, exactly as Grandpa Walt had always done, a small detail that mattered more to me symbolically than practically, a way of honoring the honest, generous arrangement that had started all of this decades earlier. The new agreement got recorded properly at the county courthouse in November, clean, documented, and permanent, replacing 50 years of informal goodwill with something no future HOA president could ever twist or misrepresent again. A strange and quietly satisfying resolution to a conflict that had never needed to happen in the first place. Cheryl's Lakeview court home went up for forced sale that winter, purchased eventually by a young family relocating from out of state, entirely unaware of the house's history beyond a vague mention from their realtor about some legal issues with the previous owner that hadn't affected the property's title or value in the end. I ran into Denise, Cheryl's old finance committee replacement, at the county feed store that spring, and she told me, somewhat awkwardly, that the new HOA board had implemented independent annual audits, term limits for board positions, and a requirement that any legal action against a non-member property require a 2/3 resident vote. We should have had those safeguards years ago, Denise admitted. We just trusted her because she seemed so sure of herself all the time. Turns out that's exactly the kind of person you're supposed to double-check hardest. Not the kind you're supposed to just let run everything without ever asking questions. Frank Delgado, I heard through Bonnie, used part of his restitution to finally restore his late wife's memorial garden properly, adding a small stone bench where he now sits most mornings with his coffee. Quiet, stubborn monument to the fact that some things really can survive being threatened if you refuse to give them up. Roy Tibbs got 3 new fencing contracts that following spring from Silver Pine residents who'd heard the whole story and wanted, as one put it, someone honest working on our property for once. A small, unexpected silver lining for a man who'd been unfairly dragged into someone else's fraud simply for doing his job well. Maisie, mercifully, remained largely unaware of most of the adult complexity swirling around her that year, though she did ask once, watching the new fence gleam in the afternoon sun, why that lady didn't come around anymore. Dana and I settled on telling her simply that the lady had made some bad choices and had to leave. Dana and I sat on the porch one evening that following spring, watching Maisie chase barn cats along the very fence line that had started this entire ordeal a year earlier. The ranch road quiet and properly documented now, the cattle grazing peacefully, the lake catching the last orange light of a long, ordinary day. You ever think about how different this could have gone? Dana asked. If you just moved the fence back that first week, paid the fine, avoided the whole fight. I thought about it for a moment, watching Maisie's laughter carry across the field. I think about it, I said, and I'm glad I didn't. because moving the fence back wouldn't have stopped Cheryl. It would have simply confirmed to her that intimidation worked, that the next family, the next widower, the next quiet homeowner too afraid to fight back would keep paying, keep folding, keep letting one person's manufactured authority quietly drain a community for years without consequence. Marissa called that summer with one final update. The last of Cheryl's asset liquidation had been completed, restitution payments beginning to flow, slowly but steadily, toward Frank, Bonnie, and the other affected residents, along with the remaining balance of my own civil judgment, closing out, finally, the last administrative thread of the entire saga. For what it's worth, Marissa added before hanging up, I've handled a lot of HOA disputes over the years, Wade, and most of them really are just petty squabbles over paint colors and lawn height. This one turned into something genuinely rare. You didn't just win your case. You actually protected an entire neighborhood. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, standing out by the fence line as evening settled over the ranch. I hadn't set out to expose fraud, or protect strangers, or take down a corrupt HOA president. I just wanted to keep my daughter safe near the water on my own land. But sometimes, I've come to believe, standing your ground on something small and true is exactly how larger, hidden wrongs eventually come to light. Not through some grand crusade, but through one honest person simply refusing to back down from a lie. Even a small one, even when backing down would have been so much easier. Grandpa Walt's old handwritten note still sits in my barn filing cabinet, protected now in a plastic sleeve. Let the cabin folks use the cut for now. Costs me nothing. Freely given. Should never be mistaken by anyone for an entitlement they're owed forever, no matter how convincingly they demand it. The ranch road runs quiet these days. Properly documented, properly respected, used exactly as it always should have been. A small courtesy between neighbors, formalized now into something no one can twist into a weapon again. Silver Pine Lake Estates has its shortcut. My family has our fence, our privacy, our peace. Bonnie stopped by that autumn with a plate of homemade cookies. An old Southern habit she said she'd almost forgotten during the stressful months of the case. We sat on the porch talking easily. No more tension between us. Just two neighbors who'd ended up, unexpectedly, on the same side of a fight neither of them chose. You know, she said, watching Maisie play in the yard, I think a lot of us in that neighborhood forgot we were allowed to ask questions. Cheryl made disagreement feel dangerous somehow, like you'd be the next target if you pushed back. It took an outsider, someone she couldn't intimidate, to finally break that spell. I didn't feel much like a hero hearing that, mostly just tired. In the particular way a long fight leaves you tired even after you've won it. But watching Bonnie relax into easy conversation on my porch, watching Frank tend his wife's restored garden 2 miles away, I understood, finally, what the fight had actually been worth. Winter came again, and with it the season my father and grandfather had always closed the ranch road for calving, a tradition I kept, hanging the same style of handwritten sign Grandpa Walt used to make, though I laminated mine. A small concession to modern practicality, he probably would have teased me for endlessly. Silver Pine residents, now genuinely informed and respectful of the new legal easement's seasonal terms, Simply took the longer route to the highway during those 2 weeks without complaint, without confrontation, without a single certified letter or Facebook post. The way, I imagine, my grandfather always assumed reasonable neighbors would behave in the first place. Sometimes, driving past the old Silver Pine clubhouse, I see Denise's HOA newsletter posted on the community board, full of ordinary things now: pool schedules, a fall festival, a note thanking residents for their patience during recent leadership transitions, language carefully chosen, I suspect, to acknowledge without dwelling too heavily on everything that happened. I ran into Cole Pretty once more that winter, off duty, at the feed store, and he nodded, a little awkwardly still, but genuinely. "Glad it worked out the way it did," he said. "For what it's worth, I think about that first fence-cutting report sometimes. Wish I'd taken it seriously the first time around." "You came around eventually," I told him, and meant it. Not everyone involved had been villains. I'd come to realize somewhere over that long year, some had simply been too trusting, too conflict-averse, too willing to assume the confident. Loud person in charge must know something the rest of them didn't. Cheryl had counted on exactly that. Maisie turned 8 that spring, and we held her birthday party out by the lake. Cattle grazing lazily in the background. The fence standing solid and unbothered along the water's edge. Exactly as it was always meant to, nothing dramatic, nothing controversial, just a simple rail fence protecting a little girl who loved that water. Dana caught me staring out at it during the party, lost in thought, and squeezed my hand. "Just a fence," she said, teasing gently, echoing what I'd said to her almost exactly 1 year earlier, back when I genuinely believed, foolishly, that this would all blow over within a week or 2 at most. "Just a fence," I agreed, laughing despite myself, watching Maisie blow out 8 candles under a sky turning gold over Cedar Hollow Lake. It had never really been just a fence. Not once anyone actually looked closely enough. But standing there, watching my daughter's ordinary, happy childhood continue exactly as it should, finally felt like one again. Grandpa Walt used to say that land only ever asks you for 2 things: patience and honesty, and that most trouble in life comes from people trying to skip straight past both of those in a hurry to get whatever they think they're owed. I understood that saying better now than I ever had before. The last I heard, Cheryl was still serving out her sentence. Restitution payments arriving slowly and consistently through the court system. Her name occasionally surfacing in county legal notices that most Silver Pine residents, from what Bonnie tells me, simply scroll past now without much reaction at all. The story finally, mercifully, growing quiet. Marissa still calls occasionally. Not about the case anymore. Just to check in. The way you do with people you've genuinely gone through something significant alongside. She told me once she keeps a redacted version of the case file as a teaching example for younger attorneys at her firm. A masterclass, she called it, in following the paper. Frank Delgado sends me a jar of honey every autumn now. From bees he keeps near his wife's restored memorial garden. A small, sweet, entirely unnecessary gesture of gratitude I've stopped trying to talk him out of, because I understand, watching him tend that garden, exactly what having it back actually means to him. Roy still comes by every few months to check the fence line, more out of friendship now than necessity, always finding some small excuse, a loose rail here, a leaning post there, to sit on the porch afterward with a cold drink and talk about nothing much at all, which somehow feels like everything. Bonnie, treasurer now, runs Silver Pine Lake Estate's finances with an almost obsessive transparency, publishing detailed monthly reports nobody really reads closely but everybody appreciates having access to anyway. Quiet, deliberate correction to years of exactly the opposite. The kind of boring, honest competence a community actually needs from people in charge. The gray pickup truck, I later learned, had belonged to Dennis Foy the entire time. Used for both his legitimate surveying jobs and his late-night deliveries to Cheryl's shed. A mundane explanation for months of mystery. Though the boxes he'd hauled in there turned out to be Cheryl's own personal financial records, hidden from her own board. She'd apparently kept them there. According to what emerged during the criminal proceedings, specifically because she trusted the HOA's own common area shed more than her own home, believing correctly, as it turned out, that homeowners association business rarely faced the kind of scrutiny a private residence eventually might under a determined lawsuit. It was, in its own strange way, the final irony of the entire saga. The very structure of unchecked authority Cheryl had built for herself, the assumption that nobody would ever seriously question the HOA president, became the exact vulnerability that ultimately exposed everything. Once one landowner outside her jurisdiction simply refused to fold quietly. I think about that irony sometimes. Mending fence posts on quiet mornings out by the lake. How the very confidence that let Cheryl bully so many people for so long was the same confidence that made her careless. Made her believe a fraudulent survey and a threatening letter would be enough to make me simply disappear. She never accounted for the fact that some people, faced with an unjust fight over something they know to be true, don't fold, they dig in, they document, they call a good lawyer, and they let the truth take however long it needs to surface. Patient the way land itself teaches you to be. Eventually, my father, visiting from Tucson that following Thanksgiving, walked the fence line with me one crisp morning, quiet for a long while before finally speaking. Your grandfather would be proud of you, he said. Not for winning the lawsuit. For not letting somebody convince you that being kind once meant owing them everything forever. That distinction mattered to me more than almost anything else anyone said throughout the entire ordeal. This had never really been about defeating Cheryl, or exposing fraud, or even protecting the ranch. Not fundamentally. It had been about refusing to let generosity be twisted, retroactively, into obligation by someone determined enough to demand it. The ranch road easement agreement, recorded now permanently at the county courthouse, includes a small clause Marissa helped draft at my request. An acknowledgement of the road's origin as an act of voluntary neighborliness by Walt Coleman in 1979. A detail with no real legal weight, but one that mattered to me personally. I wanted the record to reflect the truth of how this all actually began. Not as some grand, contested community right, but as one generous old rancher's simple decision to let his neighbors take a shortcut. 60-some years ago, long before anyone imagined that small kindness could ever become the center of a courtroom battle. Dana and I renewed our wedding vows quietly that following June. 10 years married. Out by the lake near where the fence meets the water. Maisie serving as an Extremely serious flower girl for the second time in her young life. The whole ordeal with Cheryl feeling, finally, like a distant, strange chapter behind us. Bonnie and several other Silver Pine neighbors came to the small gathering. Something that would have seemed impossible to imagine back in April of the previous year, when half that same neighborhood had piled onto a Facebook thread convinced I was the villain threatening their community's safety over 90 yards of rail fencing. Funny how things turn out, Bonnie said that evening, watching Maisie chase fireflies along the water's edge. A year ago I thought you were the outsider causing trouble. Now I think you're probably the reason half this neighborhood still trusts each other at all. I didn't quite know how to respond, so I just thanked her. Sometimes, late in the evening, I still walk out to check the fence line out of old habit. More sentiment now than necessity. Running my hand along the same rails Roy and I set that first week back in April. Back when this was supposed to be a simple, uneventful weekend project before summer arrived. It never occurred to either of us then that a routine perimeter fence would eventually unravel years of hidden fraud, expose a shadow accounting operation, and fundamentally change how an entire homeowners association governed itself. But looking back, maybe that's exactly how the biggest wrongs usually do finally come undone, quietly, unexpectedly, from something small. My grandfather never lived to see any of this, passing peacefully almost 15 years before Cheryl Pretty ever moved into Silver Pine Lake Estates. But I like to think he'd have found the whole saga almost darkly funny. The idea that his simple 1979 kindness eventually toppled a small-time embezzlement scheme run by an HOA president. Costs me nothing, he'd written, and in the truest sense, it never really had. Not for him, not for my father, not really even for me, once everything finally settled. What it cost, ultimately, was Cheryl's own carefully constructed authority. Built on years of quiet extortion nobody had ever felt safe enough to properly question. I keep that laminated, closed for calving sign now in the same barn filing cabinet as the original handwritten note. A small private museum of sorts, documenting one ordinary family's decades of quiet, honest stewardship over a small piece of Texas hill country, undisturbed by anyone's greed until, briefly, dramatically, finally was. Maisie, older now, occasionally asks about the lady from before, piecing together fragments of the story as children eventually do. And Dana and I have started giving her slightly fuller answers each year. Careful, age-appropriate versions of honesty, trusting that someday she'll understand the whole complicated shape of what happened on this land. What I hope she takes from it eventually, more than the legal details or the courtroom drama, is something simpler. That kindness is worth giving freely, that fairness is worth defending even when it's exhausting, and that the people who shout the loudest about protecting a community are not always the ones actually protecting it. The lake still catches the evening light the same way it always has, gold sliding slowly into orange, sliding into that deep, settled blue that means the day is finally, properly done. The cattle still graze along the fence line. The ranch road still runs quiet down toward the highway, exactly as it should. Silver Pine Lake Estates elected an entirely new board that following spring. Term limits now firmly in place. Independent audits scheduled annually. A 2/3 resident vote required. Before any legal action against outside property owners. Safeguards written directly, deliberately, into the very structure Cheryl had once bent so completely around her own authority. Bonnie sent me the new bylaws once they were finalized. Half as courtesy, half, I think, as a quiet kind of apology on behalf of a neighborhood that had trusted the wrong person for far too long. I read through them one evening on the porch, genuinely impressed by how thoroughly they'd learned their lesson. Marissa retired from active litigation 2 years later, moving into mediation work instead, telling me once over a final celebratory dinner that our case had, strangely, restored some of her faith in exactly what a patient, well-documented fight could accomplish against someone who'd spent years assuming nobody would ever actually push back hard enough. I think about that phrase sometimes, pushed back hard enough, because that's really all this ever was, underneath every twist and every discovery. Not some grand campaign against injustice, just one stubborn family refusing to move a fence they had every legal right to build, and refusing to stop asking questions once things stopped adding up. Cheryl completed her sentence eventually, according to the last update Marissa passed along. Restitution still being paid in slow, steady installments through the county court system. Her name a quiet cautionary footnote now in Silver Pine Lake Estate's history rather than the commanding, feared presence she'd spent nearly 6 years carefully building for herself. I don't know exactly where she lives now, and honestly, I stopped wondering somewhere around the 2nd year after the trial. The ranch doesn't need her absence explained or dwelled on. It just needs tending, the way it always has. One fence post, one calving season, one quiet ordinary evening at a time. The financial settlement, once fully collected, went mostly back into the ranch itself, new equipment, a small addition to the barn, a modest college fund started for Maisie, and a portion set aside, at Dana's suggestion, as a standing family tradition, an annual donation to the county's legal aid fund for property disputes. Somebody helped us find the right lawyer when we needed one, Dana said, explaining the idea. Not everybody's that lucky. Maybe this helps some other family who can't afford a Marissa Alvarez of their own get a fair shot against somebody who thinks they can bully their way through anything without consequences. Roy still builds fences across the county, several of them now for grateful Silver Pine residents, and jokes that our original rail fence, the one that started this entire saga, should probably have a small brass plaque on it somewhere. Though I've told him repeatedly I have absolutely no intention of turning my fence into a monument. Frank Delgado passed away peacefully 2 winters later. In his sleep, in the same house where he'd lived with his wife for over 3 decades. His restored memorial garden blooming right through that following spring exactly as it always had, tended afterward by his grown children who'd finally heard the whole story. I still drive past Cheryl's old house on Lakeview Court occasionally, now owned by that young relocated family, kids' bicycles scattered across the same driveway, where a white Escalade with a crooked HOA seal once sat, and I feel, honestly, very little about it anymore, just the quiet, settled closure of an old chapter. Bonnie still brings cookies every autumn. Roy still finds excuses to check the fence. Dana and I still watch the sun set gold over Cedar Hollow Lake most evenings. And Maisie, 12 now, still knows every inch of this land the way her great-grandfather once did. Freely, safely, without ever once having to fight for it. Some nights I still take out that plastic sleeve note from 1979. Grandpa Walt's simple, generous handwriting steady across 60-some years. and think about how far one small kindness traveled before finally, decisively, proving stronger than one person's greed, deception, and years of carefully hidden fraud built entirely on other people's fear of speaking up. The fence still stands exactly where we built it, 90 yards from a road that never belonged to anyone but our family in the first place, holding nothing back but curious cattle and the occasional stray dog, exactly as ordinary and unremarkable as any fence should ever have been allowed to be from the start. And every evening, when the light turns gold over the water and Maisie's laughter carries across the hayfield, I remember that this was never really about winning against Cheryl Pretty at all. It was simply about refusing to let one dishonest, hungry voice decide what my family's honest, quiet life was allowed to look like.